the high-rely replication capability. Here's our test setup today. This is a picture of two of the NetSwap 350 appliances that are side by side. We're going to call the box on the left high-rely Las Vegas and the box on the right high-rely Charlotte. We're going to imagine a scenario under which we're replicating data from Las Vegas to Charlotte. Now, the one thing that's a little different than it would be in the real world is that since these machines are side by side and they're on the same network, they're using a private IP address. The Vegas box is at 10.1.1.67 and the Charlotte box is at 10.1.1.98. Each one has a set of mirrors that I've set up in advance to replicate two 4 terabyte drives to one another. So we're going to imagine that we're using the Las Vegas box as a repository for network video recordings or whatever data that you want, and that we want to replicate those network video recordings on a regular basis to our office in Charlotte. So that's the way the picture looks. Let's go ahead and launch a couple of browsers so that we can see the interfaces of these two boxes, which are at the IP addresses as indicated. So the first step I have to do is I'm going to launch an instance of Firefox. And once Firefox comes up, I've got to navigate to the address that I'm looking for, which is 10.1.1.98. So I'm actually going to start with the Charlotte box. So if you remember that picture, HR admin and the password of password are the defaults for these boxes. So we get into the browser interface and you can see that I've already gone in and given this machine a host name of HR Charlotte. If I click briefly on disks, you'll see that there's disk 1 and disk 2, both are 4 terabytes, and we've combined those into what I've called mirror 1, which is a virtual drive, if you will, a set of drives that are made up of the physical disks 1 and 2. Now, the other thing I can show you about this machine, Charlotte, is if I navigate to HR Charlotte, as it's been shared, and I can just go to its UNC path, you can see we've got a couple of administrative shares, and we've got Mirror 1, that 4 terabyte volume has been shared. And I've gone ahead of time and created a folder called Network Video Recorder Data Backup. There's no data in this folder whatsoever at this time. So there's 3 steps to setting up a replication job, and they're actually in backwards order here on the replication menu. The first step is to create a target where the data is going to come. And if I click on target and select new, I'm given the opportunity to name this target. And I guess I'll create a target called the Las Vegas data. So I'm on the Charlotte machine, but this is the target's going to be for Las Vegas to send their data. I'm going to use a username of user and a password of password just to keep it simple for this demo. And we have to type that twice. Where am I going to put this data? Well, this target is going to go on to the local mirror 1 on the Charlotte machine, and since I've already created the NVR data backup folder, I'm going to specify that Vegas puts its data into that as part of its target, and I simply save that target. So now I've got Las Vegas data dumping down onto the mirror 1 drive into the folder called NVR data backup. Next thing I'm going to do, and I think I'll just open Chrome this time to hit the Las Vegas box, and 10.1.1.67 is its IP address, if you'll remember from the picture we started out with, HR admin with a password of password, and that gets us into Las Vegas box. You can see it's a very similar interface. Just to kind of show you what's on the hard drive there, same structure, disks have been mirrored up. It looks like a USB key has been plugged in, so there's an additional small volume here. But the main point is that, again, we've created a volume called Mirror 1 that's a mirrored virtual disk of disk 1 and disk 2. We should be able to see the same kind of thing where we browse to it by going to its name. And again, we have the Mirror 1 share, which is a default share. And again, I've created a folder called NVR data. But In this folder, instead of being empty, I've put some junk files. It looks like six files here that are just part of just to kind of prove there are files there. Again, the imagination here of this, if it was a real world job, is that it would be a series of video files off of my network video recorder. So let's go ahead and finish step 2 and step 3 of the replication job. So you may remember over on the far side where I'm receiving the data, I created a target. On the Las Vegas side here, we're going to do step 2, which is to create what's called a remote location. And we do that by clicking on New. We can indicate what kind of remote location. You see that we support Amazon S3 or DreamHost, the kind of Amazon S3 compatible places, file transfer protocol, secure file transfer protocol, or Dropbox. In this case, I'm doing a NetSwap to NetSwap. And name-wise, I think since this is a remote location, I'll simply call it Charlotte. And I can enter an IP address for the Charlotte machine of 10.1.1.98. And we're going to use port 873. Now notice that by default, you're using port 873. You'll have to open that port on your firewall to connect to the Charlotte machine. However, it is not necessary to create a VPN or to have routers or firewalls that support VPN, because with the NetSwap, we do support all manner of encryption. And so we, as part of setting up these replication jobs, can turn on encryption. For the moment, I'm going to leave encryption off, just not to complicate it. Save this as a remote location. And now you can see that the machine knows that there's a remote location at IP address 10.1.1.98, and it's going to use port 873, which is the default. That would obviously be a public IP address that had been routed through the firewall if we were doing this over the internet. And then the third and final step is also on this Las Vegas machine, and it's a bit of a wizard. So we create a job. So we created a target over on the Charlotte side. Then we popped over to the Vegas side and we created a remote location indicating that Charlotte was ready to go. Now we're going to create what's called a job. And again, we click New. And we again tell it that it's a NetSwap job versus one of the other types of job available to us. And we select the local hard drive where we want data to come from. And in this case, we're going to store data in the network video recording data folder. We're going to tell it that the destination is a remote location. Notice that you could replicate locally between disk to disk or from this machine to another local machine. But in this case, since we're doing remote, we're going to see if there are any remote locations defined. And of course, there is one called Charlotte because we just defined it. So we select Charlotte. But the real question is that when I specify Charlotte, which knows the IP address of Charlotte, if I click Get Targets, did it find the name of any targets over on the Charlotte side? And sure enough, there's the target we created earlier. So if we give it the username of user and the password of password that I think we used when we set up that target, we can click the test button, and it indicates that the remote machine was connected and authenticated successfully. So at this point, it appears that we've got a job underway that's communicating. We should give it a job name in the next title, and since this is a replication job that is from Las Vegas to Charlotte, I think I'll just say LV greater than symbol Charlotte. And that kind of tells me what that job does, that it sends data from Vegas to Charlotte. Notice that we have options for turning compression on so that we can make that data smaller. I'm going to leave that off for the sake of simplicity. We can specify some retries if we're having sort of problems on our internet. The other thing that's real important in terms of internet connectivity is these bandwidth limits. I mean, it might be wise to set up for many offices at 8 a.m. and maybe going until 5 p.m., which would be 1700. You might want to set up a bandwidth limit depending on what kind of pipe you have available to throttle the replication bandwidth to some number. You might want to give it only 512 kilobits a second or something during business hours. In this case, other than kind of showing you that you have the ability to throttle, I don't want to set that up right now, so I'm going to go ahead and leave the throttling alone and go next. Now this screen is something that we added so that if you wanted to exclude certain file types from the replication, for example, if you were using StorageCraft and and it uses .spf files for its full backup, you might, for whatever reason, decide to exclude all types of files that end in .spf. So you can put a wildcard in there to specify not to replicate SPF files. And that can help you keep files permanently in there that are larger, that you don't replicate or that you replicate manually so that it doesn't clog the pipe. Again, for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to leave that blank and click through to next. Now, the schedule is very flexible on replication. For demonstration purposes, I think the obvious thing to do is make it replicate every moment or 1 minute. You might choose to replicate, in the real world, perhaps 15 minutes is reasonably between the business hours of 8 and 5. So if I only wanted to replicate between 8 and 5 p.m., I could turn that on the theory that if I'm not changing a lot of data at night, there's no point in continuing to replicate every minute or every 15, depending on your schedule. And then lots of options here. Replicate every hour, every day, every week, or even as little as every month on a given day of the month. So lots of flexibility how you can set up that schedule. For the moment, we're just going to replicate every minute, and we finally finish the wizard. And what we've accomplished is that we now have a job, LV Charlotte, that is using both the remote location and the associated target on the farm machine that we've defined earlier. And the results indicate that it never ran. We can start it manually by clicking on it and say start that job, and we should see it show a percentage done. If we come back here to the NVR data backup folder, you can see that the Charlotte machine has already received those 6 files that we put in the source. So the source had these 6 files, and when we started, they were empty. In fact, we can even prove that this thing is working right by deleting those 6 files over there on the Charlotte side. And now we see we have files in our NVR data folder. However, we do not have those files in the NVR data backup folder. And within 60 seconds, what we would expect to see if this replication is occurring correctly is that those files should repopulate from the source to the destination side. And this gives you the ability to do file level incremental replication from office to office at no cost other than the internet connection that's already there. And you could also, as you saw earlier, make this same type of job work between Dropbox and also up to Amazon. And we just saw those 6 files repopulate in the Charlotte location. So by me talking 60 seconds, you can see that data flushed back in. Now with the high-rely devices, there's no real limit on the number of jobs that you can set up. So if I wanted to set a job up the other way, I'm sitting on the Charlotte box, I could go ahead and go through the same steps and replicate some portion or all of the Charlotte data back to Vegas. I can also create multiple jobs to multiple different locations, some of them going to NetSwap, some going to FTP sites. So lots of flexibility to replicate your data around without having to provide a cloud provider or pay a cloud provider. You can actually keep all this data private. So that's a quick overview of the high-rely capability in terms of replication. Thank you for listening.